the love of our sixth Imam, Jaffer Sadiq, Sallu ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. For all of our marhumeen, if we can begin with the recitation of Surah Al-Fatiha. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الذين يحملون العرش ومن حوله يسبحون بحمد ربهم ويؤمنون به ويستغفرون للذين آمنوا ربنا وسعت كل. Of our sixth Imam, Jaffer Sadiq, Salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. And because our night starts so late, with Salat al-Maghrib being close to 9:55, for us to start the program after Maghrib would make the program very late for many of us. Some have school tomorrow, some have work tomorrow. And so with our program earlier on this evening for the community to have a social event together, it was useful for us to be able to join this program together. Nevertheless, it is tonight, inshallah, after Maghrib, and tomorrow during the daytime that the actual istishhad, martyrdom of our sixth Imam alayhi salam, is to be commemorated. Our sixth Imam alayhi salam is unique amongst the A'imma alayhimus salam in that he is the longest living Imam of the entirety of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, of course other than the living Imam of our time, 12th Imam, the awaited Saviour of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala faraj al-Sharif. The Imam's time, he actually divides his time into multiple stages and periods during history. 1/4 of his life is spent during the period of the imamate of his grandfather, the 4th Imam, Zainul Abidin. Another 1/4 of his life is spent during the imamate of his father, the 5th Imam, Muhammad al-Baqir, Salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. And of course, therefore, the remaining half of his life is during the imamate of himself and the leadership of his own time. You often hear very famously from the pulpit that the Imam's time straddled across two major periods within Islamic history. There was, of course, the downfall of the period of Banu Umayyah, and then coming to the power of the time of Banu Abbas. And so what we generally know from the Imam's life is that during the time of Banu Umayyah and their fight with Banu Abbas, there was a space for the Imam to be able to increase his teaching publicly and across the various paths of the Muslim Ummah. By the time the period of Banu Abbas came in, they had clamped down very much on the practices of the 6th Imam alayhi salam, and wanted to create a state-led religion by which the Muslims would then have to refer back to. And I want to be able to talk about this for just a couple of minutes, for you and I to be able to reflect on when it comes to understanding this very sensitive time of the history of our sixth Imam alayhi salam, and for you and I to be able to appreciate what the Imam had to go through, but also some of the narrations about how he himself very subtly describes some of the issues that were occurring in his own time. And then inshallah, for the second half of the discussion, I want to be able to mention one particular narration of our Imam and try to think about how we can utilize this as an action point for you and I, how we might be able to adopt this into our own time and into our own lives, inshallah. In regards to the history of the period of our sixth Imam alayhi salam, there is a very interesting set of circumstances that preceded the sixth Imam and that stopped at the time of the sixth Imam, and that Islamic history or Islamic scholarship took a different approach during the time of the sixth Imam's life. It is unanimously agreed by all schools of thought that in history, when the first and second caliphs of Islam rose to their seat of Khilafat, they formally prohibited, banned the action of recording the hadith of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Just be very conscious of what I've said. The Prophet has spent 23 years preaching. From the time in which he passes away from this world, for the first decade, there was a policy. It was prohibited for you to write down the narrations of the Prophet of Allah. And that's unanimously accepted across history. And of course, at that time, certain reasonings were given. And the idea was that people may conflate what is the Quran with the Hadith. And so people may think that when they're saying a Hadith, that this is actually an ayah of the Quran, and vice versa. And so publicly, the expression was, don't record narrations. And in fact, if there were any scraps of paper or anything like that, those were to be done away with. Of course, from another perspective, the critique was not that there was a worry about conflating the narrations with the Quran. Because of course, this could be a problem at any time. I might mention a narration, you might mistake it as an ayah of the Quran. New Muslims may have to learn the distinguishing features between the Quran and the Hadith. This is a perpetual potential issue, isn't it? And of course, those early Muslims who were so familiar with the Quran and had memorized the Quran and had memorized the Ahadith, it was upon them to be able to distinguish and to be able to tell new Muslims which ones are which. So what was the reason as to why the first two caliphs prohibited the recording of Ahadith? Quite simple from the Shi'i perspective. The critique is that they did not want those Ahadith regarding the fada'il, the merits, the position of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam to be recorded, because as Islam grew, if these narrations are kept unknown, then those narrations would of course not be known to new Muslims around the rest of the Muslim Ummah. Now the reason why we know that this is something so correct in history, that this occurred, was because actually by the time of the fifth Imam's Imamat alayhi salam, you know that there is a very famous caliph from Banu Umayyah who's considered to be generally quite a positive caliph by the name of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was the one who stopped the cursing of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam on the Jum'ah khutbah. As you know, from the time of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, it had been instituted every Friday, the Imam of Jama'ah had to come and give a curse upon Imam alayhi salam in the Friday sermon. We also know that Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, he tried to return Fadak back to Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Amongst the things that Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz did was to institute the writing down and the recording of the ahadith that were in circulation at that time. Now think about this. If we are talking almost 100 years, let's just put it minimal 80 years of period of time has gone past. This is the lifespan of a human being, isn't it? So in that whole lifespan, a whole generation has died out. People who were children with the Prophet ﷺ, people who were companions, have all but died out. The longest living companion of the Prophet ﷺ, Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari, and he dies 2 years before Imam Sadiq alayhi salam and his imamate. So what we can see is that dies out during the time of the 5th Imam's time. So at this point you can already imagine that there's so many ahadith in circulation from the companions, from the second generation Muslims, the tabi'een, up until that point. But until then, from a governmental perspective, institutional perspective, there was no permission to be able to write down, record the ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So now, this changes. Now this becomes encouraged. Now this becomes institutionalized. Now just have a think about this for a second and just bring it to mind. Just for the sake of namesake, we have a Rasul here. Okay, so this is Rasul. And by Rasul, I mean Rasulullah. Yes? Just for his namesake, it makes it easy for us. Rasulullah here has passed away. May Allah bless you. Rise your highest station, inshallah, grant you long life. But he passes away. 80 years has now passed on. Right? So these first generations, right, the actual Sahaba, they have also passed away with him. And then those tabi'een are still at the very lengthy age, elder age. They are also towards the very end of their time. So now we actually have this generation of Muslims at the time of 80 after Hijrah, 100 after Hijrah, the time of the 5th Imam, the 6th Imam, the 7th Imam's time. Now they've got a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. The requirement is to do what? To show the chain of narration, isn't it? For you to be able to say that I heard it from Ammar, who? So Ammar ibn Yasir, mashallah. From Ammar, who heard it from the Prophet, from Rasul ﷺ, right? Now of course, because this generation has now parted ways, has departed from us, we don't have them to verify firstly what has actually come from the Prophet ﷺ. What we do have is Ammar passing narrations on to you, and you are now with narrations. The problem we also have is what? Not only is there now a cutoff, we don't have the chain directly to be able to reference what has been said, we also have had years and years of factories of ahadith being created, especially from Sham, and the factories that were generated by people like Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. So now we have all of these problems. For 80 years we have not been able to record narrations. Narrations which are completely false and fabricated have entered into the area. Islam has widened away from just being Mecca to Medina. The center points of Islam have now way beyond geographically. Kufa is strong, Damascus is strong. So the religion of Islam has become decentralized. And then of course we have the death of these great companions who are the intermediaries to the Prophet ﷺ. Now comes the point of recording ahadith. We have another problem. What did we say was the other problem? Banu Umayyah and their political interests have been waning. In order to survive, you often know that when tyrants are on the brink of being overthrown, they become even more tyrannical in order to have some sort of last grasp of their own power. Banu Umayyah and all of the things that they were doing were passing, and now Banu Abbas were coming in, which meant the Banu Abbasid interests, the language and the institutionalization of their practices were coming in and replacing Banu Umayyah. At this point, we need to start recording ahadith. This is a tragedy, isn't it, in the Islamic history? Imagine the number of ahadith that have been lost. Imagine the number of ahadith that have been interpolated into the corpus of the Islamic tradition, and so on and so forth. You have this one particular individual, our sixth Imam, Jaffer Ladak, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi, who for a period of time is given the space to be able to teach, the space to be able to travel to teach, and the space to be able to set up the institutions of teaching as well. Imagine the expectation and the responsibility upon our sixth Imam alayhi salam. When there's a barakah, when there's a ni'mah, you have to make use of it, otherwise it is taken away from you. The Imam has to make sure during this period of time, he sets a number of trends in place. Otherwise, the practices that are now being allowed, or the practices that are going to be coined by the government institutions of Banu Abbas, will end up having the same destructive outcomes as to what has occurred from that time until now. So what can we say about history that occurred at that time, and for us to think about how the sixth Imam alayhi salam was involved in ensuring the direction of the ummah was to be protected? Two major things happened. The first was the recording of ahadith, and the second was the formalization or the canonization of certain fiqh, and what you and I might refer today as sort of a risala amaliyah, meaning a codex of books, of works that could be referred back to as, these are the things that we have to follow. These are the rules of Islam that we have to follow. And the government in particular had asked one great scholar of that time, whom we know today is one of the Imams of the four madhahib of the schools of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Imam Malik ibn Anas was asked to codify the religion of Islam, to bring about laws, and of course he then needs to collect a number of traditions. And so he collects a book which is available, or said to be available until today, the original version, called the Muwatta of Imam Malik. And this is a great collection of ahadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He then also institutionalizes a codice of law and presents it as the affirmed version of the law that is presented by Banu Abbas for people to have to follow. Now this is very important to understand what is occurring at this time. Concurrently to this time, our sixth Imam alayhi salam is also ensuring the institutionalization of Islam. And he has to ensure not only the collection of ahadith, not only the collection of law, but also to ensure that the students of Islam are learning at an institutional level and can carry on the formalized learnings that are taking place at that time. The first thing that needs to be remembered is that Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam did not follow the way of the previous khulafa in prohibiting the recording of narrations. Quite the opposite. They instructed narrations to be written down. And this isn't just from the sixth Imam's time. We actually have narrations where the Prophet himself is sitting with his early companions, and he would tell them at that time, write down. We actually have narration where the companions responds and says, Ya Rasulullah, but we'll remember what you say. Rasulullah says, you won't remember what I say. Write down. I'm telling you a second time, write down what I'm saying, because you won't remember it. From that time, the practices of writing down ahadith of the Prophet was supposed to be carried out. Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi, collected the Quran, not in the collection that we have it now, not the tartib of the Mus'haf, the tartib of the Nuzul, the order of revelation itself. The first chapter, the second chapter to be revealed, all the way to 114, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam collected that. He also encouraged his companions to write down a hadith. This is why in the narrations we have what's called, for example, the kitab of such and such a companion. We have the kitab of Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari. He wrote down the narrations of the Imams at the times in which he was in. Now what's very interesting is that by the time we actually reach the period of our sixth Imam alayhi salam, for the mainstream community in Islam, writing down had become novel. Writing narrations had become novel. The sixth Imam alayhi salam used this as a means to demonstrate the difference between his religion and the way in which he was instructing and living and inheriting the religion of Allah, compared to how others had now begun to invest into creating resources to protect the religion of Islam. There's a narration that says Imam Malik, the author of this great kitab al-Muwatta, that is the collection of ahadith about the Prophet, he says, or the narration says, that Imam Malik is collecting this great book of narrations. He actually has a narration where he says Imam Sadiq alayhi salam himself is a book. I, Imam Malik, have to collect narrations and verify the chains and see what is correct and what is not correct. Even though I've done this work where thousands of narrations are being collected, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam himself is a book of narrations. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam retorted and responded. He said, or the narration says that he chuckled. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, when this reached his ears, chuckled at being called like a book of narrations in himself. He said, no, not only am I a book of narrations, I actually have the books, and I've read the books of narrations from my ancestors. I've inherited the books of narrations from each of my grandfathers up to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is what amount of a book I actually am. And he continues in this hadith, he chuckles, not only am I a book, I actually have read and I've got the books of my ancestors all the way back to the Prophet. Nay, I've even read the books of Ibrahim and Musa. Suhufi Ibrahima wa Musa, the Quran says. Imam Malik, it's wonderful that you guys are collecting narrations 80 years after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But if you want the actual narrations of the Prophet written by the hand of Ali ibn Abi Talib, written by the hands of Al-Hasan and Hussein, I have them. Come and ask me. These ahadith are actually with me, and I actually have these narrations with me. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam was saying this word to this audience at this time. What's interesting, he goes a step further now. Because it becomes normal that within the Muslim Ummah, people are now collecting narrations, they're checking narrations, they're saying which one's weak, which one's strong. We actually have narrations that says people would come back to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam and ask for his approval on those books of ahadith. Companions would collect, and companions would now come to Imam and say, can you check this? And Imam would write whether this is sound narration, whether this is a wrong narration, whether this needs to be removed, whether this needs to be kept. The next thing that the Imam did to institutionalize the protection of Islam was that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam traveled across the Ummah in order to be able to teach. And this is very important. What we don't often talk about, and inshallah maybe at another juncture when we have space, we can talk about this point a little bit more. The decentralization of knowledge was occurring. Cities like Baghdad and Qom were on the rise intellectually. Cities like Kufa began to be on the down after the time of the sixth Imam. From the time of the seventh and eighth Imam, the main Shi'i center of learning was which city? Qom. And we actually have that the earliest companions from Yemen, that family were the ones that migrated to Qom and started the Shi'i trend within Qom. We'll talk about that another time, inshallah, on an appropriate night. The sixth Imam alayhi salam traveled to Kufa and lived there for months and months in order to be able to train the scholars in that area. He even, according to some narrations, went as close to Baghdad as well in order to be able to institutionalize centers of learning. People used to come to him and they would say to him, you're departing. If we don't have access to you, to whom should we ask? To whom should we turn to if we don't have access to you? And Imam alayhi salam used to name certain companions. Say, if you can't come and find me, ask such and such a companion. Ask such and such a companion. I have trained them in certain ways. Now this gives us an avenue to be able to go off into one last point to conclude this first half of the historical context of our sixth Imam's life. The Imam actually trained scholars in different ways. Sometimes he mentions about scholars that these scholars are giant individuals generally, and sometimes he says certain of his companions have been trained with certain specialist areas. Some were specialists in aqa'id, some were specialists in fiqh. One narration from our sixth Imam alayhi salam, he says, Zurara bin A'yun, our companion Zurara, had it not been for him, our grandfather's traditions would have been lost. Think about that, the importance of one companion, such a weighty companion, that had it not been for this individual, our grandfather's knowledge would have been lost. In fact, in another narration, he says Zurara is like the tent pegs of Islam. What does a tent peg do? It holds down the tent from being blown away. Otherwise, Zurara's role was to keep the foundations of Islam to be strong. Now, we'd often talk about us coming from the Ja'fari madhab. It's a pride for us. We know that there are four mainstream madhahib. There is the Zaydi madhab. There is the Ja'fari madhab, which comes to us from our Imam, Imam Jaffer Sadiq, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. It's so interesting that we have so many different Imams from different schools of thought that are masters in different sciences. Think about this very carefully. If you need to go to a scholar of history, for example, in our Sunni community, you might go to Ibn Kathir. If you want to go to a commentator of the Quran, you might, for example, go to such and such a scholar. If you want fiqh, you go to another scholar. What is brilliant about the sixth Imam alayhi salam is that when we say he is giving us a madhab, the Ja'fari madhab, what we actually mean to say is that the entirety of the Islamic corpus can be found in this one individual. We don't need to go to 10 different people for 10 different sciences. If you want fiqh, you go to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. If you want to understand tafsir, you go to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. If you want to know science, you go to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Action this particular hadith. When I came across this hadith, I felt it was well worth taking time to reflect over it and seeing how this hadith might impact us in our daily life with different types of circumstances in our life. Our life has very much shifted to what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. The growth of social media platforms, the growth of access to people on the other side of the world through these little devices has allowed us to be able to speak to audiences, to communicate to audiences in different ways now. A WhatsApp group to your family, a WhatsApp group within the community, the social media platform gives us a different level of responsibility with the knowledge that we have. If you see to debate fiqh and the principles of fiqh and the narrations that go into fiqh Imam Sadiq alayhi salam would point you in the direction of this great companion, Zurara bin A'yun. Now notice this point. The Imam himself often used to welcome people, and when someone came to debate, the Imam would point them in the directions of certain people. When his companions would fail, he'd send them to another, and eventually to Hisham ibn Hakam. And then he would tell the companion, the reason why you were unable to defeat this questioner in your discussion was because you are weak in this area of debate. Go away and learn. Go away and practice. We actually have this in narrations. Sometimes companions used to feel disappointed that they didn't master the debate. Someone from another religion, another sect would come and debate. He would lose or not be able to win. It would become a stalemate. You're going round and round in circles. Imam would say, see, this is the area you are weak on. Go and prepare and then improve and come back. With knowledge comes responsibility. With knowledge comes the responsibility of refining it and knowing how to speak and whom to speak. Because sometimes the way in which we address one audience is not the same as how we address another. And what one audience is requiring is not necessarily the same as another audience. Sometimes with our own WhatsApp groups, sometimes with our own family gatherings, sometimes within our community gatherings, we want to think about how best to be able to address and deal with certain people and certain issues. The hadith comes to us from our sixth Imam, Jaffer Ladak, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. And this narration, he actually says that this narration comes from the Prophet, who says that Isa alayhi salam, Jesus Christ, said this narration. Jesus says the following. He said, O Banu Israel, لا تحدثوا بالحكمة الجهالة فتضلموها. It's 3 parts of the hadith. I'll just read it to you one by one and we'll think about it, inshallah. Once Isa alayhi salam said to Bani Israel, O children of Israel, do not speak words of wisdom with the ignorant so that you do dhulm, you do wrong to those words of wisdom. لا تحدثوا بالحكمة الجهال. Do not speak words of wisdom to those people who cannot get them, cannot understand them, are ill prepared to understand them, because you actually do dhulm to the words themselves. So we'll come back to this in a second, inshallah. The second part of the hadith. But also, do not prevent the wise people from receiving your words of wisdom, lest you do wrong to the wise people. To those people who are juhal, those people who are not ignorant in this sense, but those people who cannot fathom them, do not have the back knowledge to understand them, lest actually you do wrong to those words. Not wrong to those people. Why is it not wrong to those people? It's not dhulm upon those people because it's upon those people to actually raise their level of thinking. But actually these wise words of ayat, of ahadith, of anecdotes, they have a right upon you. Everything has a right. These wise words, they also have a right. And for them to be used in the correct manner, in the correct place, is the right that is upon you. So make sure you don't use words that are beyond or something that people will not understand and that they will reject, and so they will become even further away from you if you use those words. Because otherwise it's not actually wisdom. If I use, not that I can use scientific language, but if I start talking about, a deep scientific theory, and you say, I'm bored, I can't sit there, and you walk out, then actually I'm the one doing wrong. The words are beautiful, the words are true, the words are weighty, the words are golden. But if it's actually me sending you further and further away from me, then I am the one doing wrong. This is the first. The second part of the hadith, Imam alayhi salam says, and do not prevent the wise people, the people who are capable, the people who want, the people who are thirsty for wisdom. Do not deprive them. You see, it's interesting because when we're in gatherings, we have to be able to judge whom we are talking with. There are people that thirst for discussion. Sometimes politics, sometimes ethics, sometimes Islam, sometimes football, sometimes all of them. But we need to know that we are giving the right words to the right people in the right way. Those people who are thirsty for knowledge, deprive them of it. Start the conversations. See where it goes. Plant an idea. Plant a discussion. Allow an ayah to be raised. Allow a hadith to be raised. Do not prevent the wise people from receiving wisdom, lest you actually wrong the people of wisdom. You see, at that point, they have a right over you. The fact that they are craving knowledge, the fact that they want to participate, you have to be able to give that which they want. And lastly, do not help the unjust, otherwise Allah's favors upon you will be nullified. Often you and I are given so many abundance of favors from God, the health, the wealth, the freedoms that we have. And those times when we help the oppressive people, those favors will actually be taken away from us because we misused them in the way in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordained for us to be able to use them. Think about this narration for yourself. When we want to be able to apply the wisdom of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam into our own time, we have to understand the times in which he was living in, the circumstances that were constantly shifting in his time. When there was opportunity to be able to teach, like at the time of Banu Umayyah, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam grabbed hold of it, institutionalized matters, made sure that people benefited to the utmost at that time. When later on, during the period of Banu Abbas, he actually had to shift the way in which he was teaching and the way in which people were understanding the movement of Islam. We too also have to be sensitive to the circumstances, to the people whom we are in front of, how we can lift and raise people. And so similarly, in our own set of circumstances, we know that when we're speaking to people on the other side of the world, they may not have had the same education, the same experiences as you and I. Wisdom comes with how we are able to address people and how we are able to lift all people and not try to create those backlashes or to create the overthrowing of Banu Umayyah. Are you scared of jihad? Imam Sadiq alayhi salam had to respond by saying, I'm not scared of jihad. I'm very ready and willing to be able to participate in it. But I don't want to be able to waste the grace that Allah has given to me at the moment to be able to spread the religion of Islam. Wisdom of Imam alayhi salam to understand his circumstances and to be able to spread the faith in accordance with the shifting circumstances that he had. You and I can take a great lesson from this in the times in which we live in, thinking about the ways in which we can also do this in our own time. Because there was this great war between Banu Abbas and Banu Umayyah, there was great opportunity to be able to speak about the crimes of Banu Umayyah. But also from the same perspective, when Banu Umayyah had the crimes spoken about that they were partaking in, they tried to crack down as hard as possible. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam had many opportunities to be able to remember the events of Karbala and to remember the way in which his grandfather, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, was massacred on the 10th of Muharram. One narration says that once there was an elderly lady, a Shia of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, and she was walking along the streets and she tripped and she fell in such a way that she cracked a rib. And at that point, even though she was in pain, she remembered the pain of Lady Fatima al-Zahra alayha salam. She called out for Fatima alayha salam and cursed the killers of Fatima alayha salam. And those who were in charge at that time, who were enemies of Fatima alayha salam, put her in jail. And eventually the word was sent to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, and Imam Sadiq had to give her a dua in order to be released from jail. In another time, the narration says that Banu Abbas actually set fire to the house of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. That he was inside Masjid Nabawi and he was called by his companions, Imam Sadiq, your house is ablaze. The narration says that he comes running back towards the house and he sees his house burnt. He sits down by the pavement outside the house and he starts to cry. He starts to weep. The companions are confounded at this point. They say, "Oh, Imam Sadiq, we've never seen that you would cry over material things. We've never seen that you would cry over things that are worldly and dunyawi. Why are you crying? These things can be replaced." Imam begins to look up at them. You can imagine the tears in his eyes, and he responds, "I am not crying for the materials that I have lost. I am remembering when the tents were burnt on the night of the 11th of Muharram. I am remembering when the tents of Zainab and Kulthum were ablaze. When Fatima al-Sughra and Sakina had to run from tent to tent. Even now I feel grief at my house being burned. But what must Zainab and Kulthum have felt like? What must my grandfather Imam al-Sajjad have felt like when the tents were burning around them?" And you can imagine that with the amount of movement that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam was making, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam eventually was going to be attacked by Banu Abbas. They poisoned his food. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam was lying on his deathbed. Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam is sitting beside him. He is going in and out of this world with the pain that is running through his body. The last words that Imam is narrated to have said, he says to his companions with his last words, he says, "Tell my Shia that our intercession will not reach those who take their salah lightly." It is said that at this moment he wishes to be laid upon the ground. He wishes to be facing towards Karbala. He wishes in his last moments to remember the martyrdom of his grandfather Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. You can imagine that at this moment he knows that his son Imam al-Kadhim is next to him. But how is it that he must have been remembering Imam al-Hussein, who was next to Imam al-Hussein when Hussein was being slaughtered? There was not Sajjad next to him, there was no Abbas next to him, but there were 10,000 soldiers surrounding him. 10 of them came forward. They would hurl stones at the blessed face of Imam al-Hussein. They would throw spears at him. They would throw arrows into his body. But then there would be Wal Man'un that would step forward. There would be Shimr that would step forward. He would kick Imam al-Hussein over on towards his back. He would straddle upon his chest. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the appearance of Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, to allow us to be alongside him at all times in our life and in our death. If we're to pass away from this world before his coming, Ya Allah, raise us from our graves so that we can partake in the victories of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. Ya Allah, grant us the ziyarah and the intercession of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam fi dunya wal akhirah. We ask you, Ya Allah, there are many hajat that we have for ourselves, our family members, our community. Ya Allah, grant them all bihaqqi Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. And in the final moments of our life, we die in the love of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. Wassalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In honor of our 6th Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, let us recite 3 loud salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad.
Ziyarat. As you all know, the theme of this next year or so will be faith in action. Now, the Sheikh from the pulpit gave you a hadith which had three components within that hadith. What we would like to do, and there's no age restrictions on this, is take that particular hadith and try and implement it within your own lives and make a recording or a note on it. And we ask you to sort of submit that over a period of time. You don't have to do it straight away, but after you've actually implemented it. And then at the end, when we come to the end of this particular theme, we will then be judging all these entries, and there will be quite a decent prize for the best entry. So again, in the name of faith in action, we want to try and see whether we are able to emulate some of the things from our Masumin. And this was one hadith that the Sheikh narrated, and inshallah every majlis, when we are talking about Masumin, there will be a certain hadith which will be asked, which will prompt you to see if you can follow, record it, and then send the entries through. And inshallah at the end we will assess, or the Sheikh and the judges will assess these entries, and inshallah there will be a prize that you won't be disappointed with. So please,
I'll send you the hadith, you can send it out.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
can have it.
we will circulate that. And also there is a recording, it's on YouTube, so you can go back and re-listen to the majlis if you want, or listen to that part where there is, but we'll actually do that. So this is what we'll try and do. I highly encourage, if we can't all do it, let's try and do it for our own benefits, but especially those kids. So if you're here and playing with your phones and not listening, then I suggest you go back and log on to the YouTube channel, listen to it again, and then pick out those hadiths, and then inshallah when you then submit these entries through, you'll be pleasantly surprised if you are one of those winners. Salat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. زيارة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.